Welcome back, everyone, for our next and our final keynote this evening, The Mystery of Species, The Way Forward in Common Ancestry by Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. Dr. Jeanson has a bachelor's degree in molecular biology and bioinformatics from the University of Wisconsin-Parkside and has a PhD in cell and developmental biology from Harvard University. He developed a biological research program at the Institute for Creation Research, ICR, currently the research biologist at Answers in Genesis. Dr. Jeanson is also the author of several books, Replacing Darwin, The New Origin of Species, and Replacing Darwin Made Simple, and Traced Human DNA's Big Surprise. He's recently done a lot of work with this. If you're not familiar, he's done a couple different video podcast with Answers in Genesis, talking about lots of interesting things that he's found regarding this. I mentioned before his dad was in the Navy, a particular affinity to the Navy. And when his father was in the Navy, he married a German, his mother. And so going back to Germany was sort of an annual experience for him, led him to his love of other cultures, and even embarking on, or I should say, even in enjoying food from these other places. Even though he grew up a particularly picky eater, now he loves to just invite himself over to guests from other countries and say, hey, cook me your favorite meal. So with that introduction, come on down, Dr. Jeanson.
Thank you. I'm going to try one more thing to hide one more screen.
Right.
And make sure I didn't take away our video from, can you still see the video on your screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. And I might also get a laser pointer. That's visible too? Okay, good.
It is.
And I'm glad you told my favorite story, which I did grow up in Wisconsin, eating fairly normal food, I guess you could say. And I do have a habit now. So we just had some Moroccans move into the neighborhood. And I went over to, we brought them some food, and of course they're very hospitable. And then my first question to the husband was, do you have a mother-in-law here? Because I wanted to know if she'd cook for us, because they normally do. And my wife usually gets embarrassed and groans, but I think she likes the tasty results of all this. So this is now a habit of mine that I like to brag about, and just to give her a hard time about too. And we have 4 kids, 9, 8, 6, and 4. So our house is never dull, and I enjoy it, never quiet. And that's me. So what I want to do this evening and tomorrow, there's sort of 2 parts to the points I want to make. Tonight, I call it The Mystery of Species, because that's the main sentiment I want you to walk away with. So also hello to those of you watching online. For all of you, what I want you to walk away with tonight is that there's more mystery. There are more questions surrounding species than we commonly assume. So if you walk out of here thinking, I never thought about that, that's the point. There's more questions to solve than we've commonly assumed. And then tomorrow, I've got a title something like the puzzle of common ancestry. The point of tomorrow is that there are more answers to the mystery of species than we commonly assume. And both of those ideas are going to be true at the same time, as we'll soon see. So we're going to take a little journey together in ways perhaps you haven't thought about when you think about the origin of species, think about the origin of kinds. Perhaps some of this will make you uncomfortable, but again, the point is to raise questions to see, okay, this is what we're going to try to work on, and then set up for tomorrow. Here's the way forward, I think, to how to solve it. So I want to derive for you the mystery of species by a series of observations that we'll make together, which again, may be a little bit stretching. If it does, good, because that's kind of the point. I enjoy these sorts of things, and I hope you will too. On their surface, species don't necessarily present much mystery. They just are. We all recognize them. Elephants, giraffes, zebras, and such. They reproduce more of themselves. Whales produce whales, zebras produce zebras, elephants produce more elephants. But if you begin to look below the Earth's surface, or if you are up here in Wisconsin, so my wife is from Alabama, and the first time she came up here, she said, do you all burn the dirt? Because in Alabama, dirt's red, it's not black. So this is ice age dirt, thanks to the glaciers. And if you look below the Earth's surface, or so we're in Kentucky, we have Big Bone Lick, where you have ice age, mammoths coming in, or mastodons coming in for salt. This doesn't exist today. Something's changed. You look even deeper in the Earth's surface, you find fossils of creatures that cannot be found anymore on this planet. If we think about elephants or elephant-like creatures, this guy doesn't exist anymore. This guy doesn't exist anymore. There's some strange and fascinating creatures that are gone. And in fact, if you add them all up, whether you add up the animals, or the mammals, I should say, in terms of species or in terms of families, it doesn't really matter. About 75 to 80% of all mammals are gone. You think about extinction, and we often talk about dinosaurs, but there's been a massive disappearance all across the animal kingdom. Mammals being one of the better represented types of creatures in the fossil record in terms of vertebrates and such. So that raises the question, what happened? Why does today's world look so different than whatever once was? And that's a pretty big question. And rather than try to tackle it head on, what I want to do first is ask some more mundane questions of existing species. And this will take us on an unusual journey, perhaps, in thinking about the puzzle of species. It'll begin to bring these questions to the forefront. So I'm going to use zebras as an example, this particular zebra species. And the first basic question we want to ask is, where do these guys live besides zoos? Of course, the answer is in sub-Saharan Africa. I've tried to highlight here, make my laser pointer show up, the regions in red here in Africa where zebras exist. Well, why do they exist in Africa? In a sense, we can answer in a very kindergarten way in light of what I just said. They're part of the 25% that has survived. 75% of mammals are gone, so they live in Africa because they survived there. They've made it to this day instead of going extinct. Well, why have they made it to this day instead of going extinct? And I'm phrasing things in terms of survivability. It tends to be used in evolutionary contexts more than creationist ones, but even if I'm talking here from a flood perspective. And in case there's anyone watching online who may not be a creationist, welcome to you, special welcome to you too. And I hope you'll enjoy listening to how creationists think. And there'll be some stuff dealing with evolution directly as we go on. But that's a side note. This whole concept of they survived, I'm using this in a creationist, post-flood, massive amount of animal kinds have gone extinct. How come these guys are in Africa? Well, they've survived to this day there. How do they survive to this day there? Stripes are one of the defining features of zebras, and to our eyes at least, they seem to play some role in camouflage. There's two zebras here. This baby is nursing from mom, though you can't quite tell because they're well camouflaged in this image. This is actually, might surprise you, it's still a matter of debate in the mainstream community. What exactly zebra stripes do? Does it ward off certain types of biting flies? Does it play a role in camouflage? Does it actually camouflage the zebra against, let's say, a lion or a leopard? What do they see? It does something, though. These zebra stripes seem to do something to help them survive. And in fact, this is a preeminent feature of species around the globe. This was a common observation in Darwin's day. Species look well designed for their environments. One of the most straightforward observations that exists, one of the simplest steps of logic people took to conclude God must have designed species in their current locations. Ignores the flood, of course, but it's a strong observation. They seem to fit their environments very well. So, zebras exist in the savannas of Africa because they have survived there, because they seem to fit those environments well. They can survive well there. That's not the only spot on our planet where savannas exist. Technically, Africa is a tropical savanna, and in the Midwest would be more of a temperate savanna, plains, Great Plains and such. But you can find the Cerrado of Brazil. There's in the up here in the northern India, Nepal region, there's a savanna. Northern Australia, there's a savanna, but no zebras. So this is one of the questions of Darwin's day. If God designed species for their environments, why don't they exist in every instance of that environment? Why only in the African savannas? And one of the clues to answer this question, which again, this is the point of what we're doing here, is to raise the questions, the mystery of species. One of the clues to the zebra question comes from islands like Hawaii. Hawaii has 9 indigenous mammal species. I've shown 3 here. You have the Hawaiian monk seal, the hoary bat, and the killer whale. Now, there's something these mammal species have in common that gives us a clue to the origin and distribution of zebra species. Can anyone recognize what these mammal species have in common? And I'm going to pull up the Q&A part here of the chat, because if you're watching online and you've got an answer, you can type it in, I can see it. What do these species, as diverse as they are, have in common?
Mobility.
Mobility? So what do you mean by mobility?
They can move around by water or air.
Okay, and that's exactly the answer. What they have in common is something that in a sense they all lack. They're not bound to the land. They all can move through the water or over the water, either by swimming or by flying. What islands tend to lack is land-dependent creatures. You don't find horses, donkeys, unless they've been introduced by humans. And there's a statistical element to all this. It's not an absolute rule that flying or swimming mammals are indigenous to islands. The closer islands are to land, the greater the chance that some can swim over. Like the Galapagos Islands have the Galapagos tortoise. It's a land animal. But the Galapagos are a lot closer to South America. In fact, I think I can show you here on this next map. I click back in. There. Land mammals are missing. Here we go. So Hawaii is way out here. And the Galapagos are much closer to South America. Anyway, Madagascar is close to Africa. The further away the island is, the less chance there is that you'll find some land-dependent creature. Now, Alfred Russel Wallace is the guy who's responsible for the map that I'm showing you here. This map takes what we've just observed and generalizes it. This is a map of what's called regions of endemism. So what Wallace did here was not to colorize this map based on geographic features or topographical features. What Wallace did was to draw and shade regions of the globe based on what types of creatures exist there. So endemism, a species that's endemic to a region, means it exists there and nowhere else. And the zebras belong to this area in yellow. They're one of many species that are found in sub-Saharan Africa or over here in Southern Arabia and nowhere else. Madagascar, of course, has a whole bunch of species only there and nowhere else. You can think of, so the chimpanzees are found in sub-Saharan Africa, nowhere else. And over here in this sort of magenta, pinkish, purplish color over here, the Oriental region is what it's calling it. Orangutans exist in this region, nowhere else in the globe. So here you have a map that's showing you regions of the globe based on their species content. Certain animals exist here and nowhere else. Certain animals exist here and nowhere else. Some here, of course, Australian marsupials, one gigantic category. They're found in Australia, nowhere else. Sort of a Central and South American region. In green here, a North American region. What's interesting is that these regions that are defined based on the creatures that exist there have strong correlations with the topography. And you look at this map and you think it's based on topography, not on animals. Here's a better map just on topography. Of course, one of the most notable features of Africa is the very brown Saharan desert that keeps creatures in. And of course, Africa is surrounded by water on these sides over here. And of course, if we go back here, the Oriental region, very strong separation from China and the rest of Eurasia, because you've got the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau, strong barrier to migration from India over this way. Even humans who can cross some of the, we build boats, we have technology that animals that aren't sentient like we are, they can't do that. Even this has been a barrier to human migration. There's very little interaction throughout human history between India and China because you have these geographic features separated. And of course, Australia being a fairly significant island. Here you've got the zebra distribution. Once again, they exist in sub-Saharan Africa, not other savannas, but they happen to be in one of these regions that Wallace defined as a region of endemism. It's got the Saharan desert that keeps it in. Okay, so the big point here with Wallace's map was that the general principle we observed with islands, creatures that exist there because they can migrate there. Creatures that don't exist there because they can't migrate there. That's a general principle that you find around the globe. Barriers to migration define regions of endemism. Here, I'm going to show you this map. So you can't migrate across the Tibetan Plateau very well. You can't migrate through the Indian Ocean very well. And you've got a region of endemism. You can't migrate across the Sahara very well. You've got a region of endemism. You've got this sort of neck that's surrounded by water here, Central America, that makes it a fairly narrow passageway for migration, defines a region of endemism. That's the principle. So if you apply that then to the question of zebras, why do they exist in the African tropical savanna, nowhere else? Well, I guess because they migrated there. That would be the natural conclusion. We could stop there, except that the story of zebras is more complex than that because there's more than one species recognized. There's multiple subspecies, and we can talk about that topic a little bit later, how they're actually classified. But to our eyes, it's fairly easy once you know what to look for. It's fairly easy to distinguish the various zebra species. So in this case, this is the plains zebra. You'll notice that the stripes cross the belly. They're fairly thick on the haunches. The mountain zebra, its stripes do not cross the belly. It's got a white belly, and it's hard to see here because we're looking from the side. But if you look down the spine of the plains zebra, he lacks what's sort of this gridiron pattern that goes across the back of the mountain zebra down its backside here. And then the Greve zebra, the imperial zebra, you'll notice it has the densest stripes. You got pretty thick stripes on the haunches for the plain zebra, more density right here, but still some thickness on the haunches there. This guy's all very thin, dense stripes, and of course they don't cross the belly either. And they have the same distribution, sub-Saharan Africa only. So does that mean then we should explain the origin of all, or at least the distribution of all three zebra species by the process of migration? Well, the general principle that we just discussed, here we go, yeah. The general principle that we just discussed is that barriers to migration define regions of endemism. Perhaps an original zebra species just happened to get across the Sahara at some point, but it's hard to get back out. The Saharan desert and the surrounding water makes it hard for the zebras to escape Africa. That's why they haven't gone off to India. They haven't gone off to Australia. They haven't gone off to the Americas. If that's the line of reasoning we want to pursue, can we really invoke that in a mathematically satisfying way for all three zebra species? What's the chance that all three zebra species just happen to migrate into this spot and nowhere else, and none of them happen to migrate back out? When's the last time you thought that geography would be an argument for common ancestry? That was Darwin's argument, in fact, against the fixity of species. The geographic distribution of species, the statistics of it, argue that no, in fact, it's more likely that a single zebra species migrated in, and there's differences among them, a single species migrated in, and then subsequently diversified into the species that we see today. And there's other examples we could use. If you read Replacing Darwin, I go through several examples of this in chapter 4. This is one argument for common ancestry. I want to give you another one, make another observation to raise the mystery of species. And I'll tell you exactly what I mean by the mystery in a moment. I'm going to show you a few slides here. I'm going to pull up the bar here so I can see if you're online and you're typing in questions. I'm going to go through about 4 slides here, and I want you to tell me how many species you see. Okay, so you take a mental snapshot of this, take a good look at the features that unify and distinguish the various animals that I show on the screen. And then I want you to tell me how many species are represented. So here's the first screen. There's the second screen. Again, you'll have to take mental. I'll go through this twice so you can look at it again, compare and contrast the varieties that you see, the similarities, the differences. Then the third one, little bit more variety, and then the fourth, which you'll see another obvious difference here. So I'm just going to jump back to a certain slide. I guess I just have to go back through it this way. So there's screen number 1 and 2. Again, if you're online, type it in the Q&A or the chat. I can see it. How many species did I show you?
1 Barraman.
1 Barraman. Okay. Good. That's it from last hour. Yes. True. That'd be true. How many species? Say it louder.
Depends how you divide them.
Depends how you divide them. Okay, just throw out a guess.
10 pictures, 10 species.
10 pictures, 10 species. Okay, that'd be fair.
I'll just say 1 for everything.
1 for everything. Okay. Did someone whisper something else?
I would say 6.
6. Okay. Would you say there is more variety? I want you to take, oops, I gotta click on this here. I want you to compare these 4 screens to another screen. Would you say there's more variety among these? Well, it's all one species. They're all part of the same horse species. There's various breeds of horses. Is there more variety among these 1, 2, 3, 4 screens, or among these 7 pictures? Which one has more variety? 4 screens I just showed you, or this screen right here?
4 screens.
4 screens, okay. These 7 images represent 7 species, at least according to current classification. Plain zebra, mountain zebra, the imperial zebra. This is, well, I was going to say the wild horse. Technically, the wild horse went extinct in the wild, has been reintroduced. This is the Przewalski's horse. We have one in the Cincinnati Zoo. So Ancestry and Genesis is in northern Kentucky, just outside Cincinnati. We've been there. I've actually emailed the zookeepers. And occasionally, the Przewalski's horse, at least the ones I think they had there, will have a bar, sort of an echo of a stripe on the back of its leg. These are Asian wild asses, and this is the African wild ass. You can see stripes on its legs. These breeds, all one species, all have a common ancestor almost by definition, because we were the ones who produced them. We mixed and matched. I want a white horse with brown polka dots. So you find polka dot horse, a brown. Anyway, you find that the parents that you want to produce the outcome that you want. And I think we all agreed these guys look like they have more variety than do these guys. And this was part of Darwin's argument as well. If these guys all have a common ancestor, then can these guys have separate ancestors? Can you have this much variety from a single source, which again, we all have to concede because we did it. We, collective humanity, has done this. Surely these guys must have a common ancestor as well. Now, you might say, if you're looking at this with a critical eye, none of these horse breeds have stripes like a zebra. So I don't quite buy your argument that you're putting zebras in this same category. Maybe this side of the screen right here, you got the horses and some of these wild asses. Maybe we could throw in this African wild ass, but it's got stripes too. There's no horse breeds with stripes. How do you explain that? It's a fair objection. I see that objection going away, though, when you consider extinct species like the quagga, which was basically a partially striped zebra. There is an effort underway called the Quagga Project. These are images from this website to reproduce the quagga, in which they're trying to breed the stripes off the zebra. So you can see here this guy, this individual, his legs black, stripes. They're fading here on the haunches, fading even more here on the haunches, looking more and more like a quagga. These are pretty good examples of this, specimens that make us think they're getting closer. There was one that completely lost it. Actually, I lied to you. This is the Asian wild ass. But the point is, it's kind of hard to distinguish it once you put them in a sequence like that. Those seem to nullify the objection that the horse breeds don't have stripes. the wild species do? Well, it's kind of easy to put them on, take them off. In terms of putting them on, and Matthew referred to this earlier as well, there are hybrids. This is a horse and a donkey cross between a horse and a zebra, and a donkey and a zebra. If you've been to the Creation Museum, actually now they're down at the Ark Encounter. We've seen them in the zoo. I think these are some of the prettiest animals that exist. It's fairly easy by breeding to put stripes on, take them off. So I think this argument still stands. If these guys have a common ancestor, these breeds, which again, by definition, humans produced, then surely these guys do as well. The question is, where does this stop? I'm taking you down the primrose path. Where do you draw the line with common ancestry? Do these species have a common ancestor? And how would you know? You might say, well, by the argument I just used, actually to back up here, there's a tremendous amount of differences between the zebra and a tapir, or a donkey, a wild ass, and a rhino. And all the diversity within horse breeds or donkey breeds will never bridge the gap between a equid, to refer to all the asses and zebra species together. They'll never bridge the gap between an equid, let's say, and a tapir and a rhino. And it's even harder to bridge the gap, let's say, between a zebra and a killer whale. Well, you're sure. I've just given you a comparison of equid breeds or horse breeds. I want to do another comparison for you. The question I want to set up, and then I'm going to give you a bunch of slides to try to answer, is, do any of these three animals have a common ancestor? And the way I want you to answer that for me, I've got, let's see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I've got about 90 slides, 100 slides I'm going to run through real fast of various animals, one animal per screen, one species, one type of creature per screen. And what I want you to do is basically take mental snapshots one after the other. I'm going to say, okay, let's compare this to this. And I want you to decide where common ancestry stops. So if you look at this guy, you look at this guy, it's a white-tailed deer, mule deer, and you say, no, let's have a common ancestry. You don't need to say anything. So I'm just going to, cycle through these fairly methodically. And when I reach the point where common ancestry stops, shout out, raise your hand, do something, and let me pull up the chat here too. Okay, actually put it in the Q&A. I think that'll notify me if you're online. Put it in the Q&A. If you find the spot at which you say stop, that's where common ancestry stops. Okay. Now I'll go through this whole list twice. So if you're a little hesitant, you want to see the whole picture at once, and then before you make your decision, fine by me. So I'll go through this fairly regularly, fairly methodical pace here. So we're going to compare one image to another, just in sequence. When do you see a pair of species? So just compare two to you, the white-tailed deer, mule deer, keep going here, elk. You tell me when the boundary of common ancestry stops, where I've just showed you two species that must have different ancestors, or you might say belong to different kinds, if we want to use the term, or different baraments from the previous hour. When do you find an animal that doesn't fit or doesn't have a common ancestor with, well, I started with a white-tailed deer, but I'm walking you through a sequence of basically pairs, one after the other. And I want you to tell me when we've reached a point where you say, definitely not a common ancestor with the one we just showed before. So these are all living species, living animals, no extinct ones, no fossils. Some you might find in zoos. I want you to tell me when we reach the point in which it's clear that we're no longer talking about common ancestors. And then, of course, we're going to come back to the question. We had a bison, we had that bighorn type sheep, and we had the white-tailed deer. And my question which is what this exercise is designed to answer, was which of those three, if any, have a common ancestor, which of those three belong to the same kind? There's a reason I'm going through this many images. There's a method to the madness. And part of it is because I want to see what you all say when it becomes too many differences to describe as common ancestry. If you've studied classification, you might already have the answer. Well, actually, I don't know that classification will give you the answer. I will tell you how they're classified in a moment. But if you're having trouble with it, again, the point of this lecture is that there's mystery to species. Now we're here at hartebeests, wildebeests, probably recognize these. There's a gaur. There's the Indian water, or the Asian water buffalo, African water buffalo. That's the European bison or the wisent. There's the American bison, which is one of the ones that we looked at earlier. This is a takin. We have one of these at the Cincinnati Zoo. Musk ox. This is an Indian, smaller version of the wild buffalo, another Indian species, a nilgai. I recognize the eland, Western giant eland, one of my favorites. This is a Nyala, bongo, another Cincinnati Zoo one. We haven't been to Milwaukee in a while, otherwise I'd tell you what's in Milwaukee. Mountain Nyala, this is a kudu, bushbuck. It's a tunga. Some of these may obscure. There's some of these that show up in zoos. Some of them are just too foreign and odd to show up in many places. Looks like it comes out of Star Wars. Ibex. There's the doll sheep, looks like a bighorn sheep. Another one of the three that we looked at. The serow. And the mountain goat. And now we're back to where we started in a sense. I'm gonna, instead of cycling through all those species, there, I'm gonna cheat and scroll back faster. Okay, that was round one, that was practice. Now you get to shout out when you say we've reached the point. Oh, here's a Q&A. You go far back, if you go far enough back, those all had common ancestors, okay? So basically the end. So John online is saying that there is no point in that whole sequence where common ancestry stops. So basically saying all of those belong to the same kind. That's his comment, if I'm interpreting it correctly. Okay, so again, if you're online, type it in the Q&A box, and I can see it because it gives me an alert. Chat, I think, doesn't notify me necessarily, and if you're here, just shout out or whatever when you say that's the point of no return, to the point at which the common ancestry ends. So I think we probably all agree white-tailed deer and mule deer are common ancestor, but is there a point in this sequence? Round two now, same thing. No surprises here, same sequence. Is there a point at which we say?
I say that the moose is not the same, it's radically different.
Okay, moose you'll say is out of the same grouping as white-tailed deer. Okay, separate ancestry there. So an early vote for separation. We've got an early vote for separation so far. We've got a no separation vote at all. What point do we say common ancestry stops? So if you've been following the train of thought, the logic, the observations, that's going to be my point. Trying to distinguish common ancestry and separate ancestry is harder than it looks.
Because there's fur, there's no fur, but there's antlers.
Okay.
With the fur, without the fur, so it's kind of confusing to look at it and say, oh, I got the answer.
Yes. Yes. And that's part of the point.
But then later in the season, some of them lose the so-called fur.
Yeah.
During the rut and fall, like
Yeah.
white-tailed deer lose that
Yeah,
about.
okay. This is a muntjac, by the way. This is a poodoo. This is a diker. It's the name for that category. We have one of these at Cincinnati Zoo. No other brave souls. Or maybe no, or maybe I haven't reached the point where ancestry stops.
Antelope species, yeah.
These are some of the gazelles and such. Impala. Many of these belong to that yellow African region that we talked about, Wallace's regions of endemism. Many of these types of animals are found there and only there, nowhere else. Oryx, Arabian oryx. This is the rowan antelope, the sable. You can compare his facial features.
This horse-like,
Yep, with this guy's markings.
are those ruminants or not?
Yes.
It's okay. And then the source are single stomach.
And this is the hartebeest. Look at this guy's skinny face.
I would say right there is the stoppage for me. It looks more bovine.
So at the wildebeest is where we say there's a break.
Yeah.
Okay. Two different species of wildebeest. This is the blue one. This is the black one. Okay. Vote right there.
Wildebeest.
Wildebeest. Okay. This is an Indian. This is a gaur. This is the Indian or the Asian water buffalo. This is the African water. Okay. Then the European bison or the wisent.
Are many of them existing yet, the European bison?
I don't know the numbers offhand, if they're endangered or not. There is a, there was a wild Europe, I forget the name of it. There's a wild European bovid owl-like creature that the auroch, I think, yeah, that's gone extinct. Extinct, and I think they're trying to recreate it again, like they're trying to recreate the, the half-striped zebra.
I think Kaiser Wilhelm II shot a lot of those animals.
Okay.
He had just, I wouldn't say impressive, but he liked to shoot things.
Okay.
He had just categories of stuff he shot, and some of them he put into extinction portion.
Okay, so for those of you online, comment from the audience about how Kaiser Wilhelm may have been primarily responsible for the extinction of one of the European bovid species, aurochs.
Well, it started World War I.
So back to the eland, giant eland, the other spiral horned antelope species like the Nyala, kudu, bushbuck, Sitatunga, greater kudu. This is an addax, black buck. What is that? Star Wars.
What's the name of that
Sounds
one?
like
The one with the
ranch.
nose?
This is a Saiga, S-A-I-G-A.
Well, sounds like a video game.
Yeah, I think it's in the Mongolia, China region.
It's unusual.
So those are like sheep or lamb, like it's changed.
Yeah,
This would be, I'm trying to remember where it falls in the family tree. I can tell you when I exit out of this here in a minute, where exactly it falls in the family tree.
we're getting into sheep and goats.
So yes, we are in the sheep goat section. When did we transition? That's the question. Hard to tell. So then this is also considered sheep, these cirrhows, sort of that section, sheep goat section. So if you use a hard and fast rule, that family, the classification level of family, approximates what a kind is, deer, Cervidae, is one family. And Bovidae includes both cattle and sheep. Which would mean these have a common ancestor. And it's separate from the deer. And the difference, by the defining difference in terms of classification, how biologists classify deer and bovids, is whether or not the horns are branched. I'm going to go back here and tell you where this now. So where in the sequence did we actually cross over from cervids, deer, to bovids? Where's my laser pointer? There. So this is considered deer family, elk is part of the deer family. So is the caribou. Moose is considered deer family. It's an early branch if you look at the mitochondrial DNA-based tree, but it's considered part of the deer family. This is the, I think, European red deer. There's some weird or unfamiliar Asian deer species. There's plenty of deer family species in the Americas as well. I'll get to those in a minute. Those come a little bit later. Brockets and such. This is all still deer family. Again, branched horns. Muntjacs, I think they have branched horns. I think they're East Asian primarily. There's a musk deer in here somewhere. Now, these are some of the American other, I think primarily South American deer, brockets and such. Poodoo is South, it looks almost, what a strange looking creature. This is still deer family. So here's the defining line between deer and bovids. This is the duikers. There's several different species of duikers. They form their own little subfamily within bovids, but these are considered the same family as their cow, as a Holstein. Several different species of duikers.
So small.
They're like yay big. The Cincinnati Zoo is the only place I've seen them, and they're quite tiny. And of course, the various antelopes and such, again, you can see straight horns, or I should say not just straight horns, unbranched horns. These are all considered bovid. So the antelopes, the cattle, and the sheep, all part of the same family. And if I put it to you that way, then you might say, well, should be below the level of family. Should we put cattle in one group and the duikers in another group, the antelopes in another group, and the sheep and the goats in another group? Well, that's the question. If we walk through this whole cycle, where do you draw the line between the duikers and some of the antelopes and such, the impalas? Because there's a tremendous amount of diversity even within them. Is there enough diversity to bridge the gap, so to speak? Sure, sometimes the horns get long, but you look at the markings on that guy's face, the markings on that guy's face, there's all sorts of features you could point to. Do you separate them because this guy's horns go straight up and this guy's horns curve? This guy's horns go almost straight up and curve, they're long. They have a little curly Q to them. And again, I think some of you had said that the wildebeest does look cattle-like, and indeed it does. If you look carefully at its face, this guy and this guy, they both have fairly long, skinny faces. And in terms of mitochondrial DNA, the wildebeest are classified within the hartebeest subgroup, not within the cattle subgroup. They're just genetically closer. And of course, you got the more obvious cattle-like creatures that have several features in common. But then there's this, which seems like a cross between a cattle, a sheep, and antelope. It's a mishmash of things, talking.
Almost bear-like too.
Yeah, I think the musk ox genetically is closer to sheep and goats than it is to cattle, even though we all look at it and think it's some type of cow. The Tamawa, I think is what this is called, cattle-like. This guy is basically almost a cattle-like body and a what type of face? Yeah. What about these guys? Pretty stocky bodies and then skinnier faces that we wouldn't call cattle-like, but this is all living species. No transitional forms, no fossils, all just what exists. 135 species in the bovid family, which of course includes cattle, sheep, and goats. So where do you draw the line between the sheep and the antelopes? And where do you draw the line between the antelopes and the cattle? That's part of the question. I need to look this up. Remind me at the end. I can look it up. I have a tree in one of these papers that has the whole, or probably 100 bovidae species, and this has a mitochondrial DNA sequence. I don't remember offhand where it branches off. I think it's an early brancher, kind of a unique thing. So, where do you draw the line? Hard to tell with a family as diverse as this one. Which is the point of bringing that whole sequence up.
Can't help but thinking that if many of these would be extinct today, that they would be pointed to as saying they're missing links.
Yes,
You know what I mean?
yes. Comment from the audience was, what if this was one of the? So there's whole families that are now gone. There's families that have hardly any species. This happens to be one of the more species-rich families. What if most of the living species within this family were gone, and they were only existing as fossils? Would they not be called transitional forms? Because they seem to connect these various groupings. Well, we've looked at external appearances. Back to this question now. I'll make this go away again. Let's revisit this one. Can we draw a line of common ancestry between the equids, like donkeys and zebras, and the other members of their order, rhinoceri and tapirs? What if we look below the surface? Structure anatomically of, let's say, a horse and its equid relatives. You could compare the structure of the equid forelimb to those of other mammals and humans, and you'd find a similar pattern. One bone, one or two bones right here, so that the various shades of gray are to allow us to compare the order of the bones across these various species. One or two here, wrist bones, digits. 1, 2, wrist bones, digits. 1, 1, wrist bones, digits. 1, 1, wrist bones, digits. 1, 2, wrist bones, digits. They're not identical, but there's a clear underlying pattern of similarity, which of course is what the evolutionary community uses to argue for the common ancestry among all of them. But what's the difference between that argument and the one we just looked at? This one is maybe easier. How can you connect a zebra and a killer whale? Seems impossible. What if we had something like this, though? This is an artist's reconstruction of Tiktaalik. I think it's actually a field museum of Chicago guy, Neil Shubin, who was the discoverer. And his book, Your Inner Fish, makes a big deal about we knew exactly where to look because of the order of the fossils in the fossil record to find something like this. It seems to have features of aquatic creatures, limbs like fins and scales, yet the head looks very tetrapod-like or amphibian or reptile-like. Seems to blend the features of aquatic and land creatures.
That the evolution for the alligator, crocodile, is that what they're beginning argument there for?
They would say this connects the fish to the first, so they'd say tetrapods, the first early land creatures that became reptiles, amphibians, and mammals. And they say the mammals evolved back into the water and became whales. A very complicated evolutionary process. So they technically would not use that guy as an intermediate between zebras and whales. They'd say it's an intermediate between fish and zebras.
But it's an artistic interpretation.
Yes, it is an artistic interpretation. The actual fossil itself is basically this section right here. So the reason I bring it up is based on external appearances, pretty big gap right here, right? Well, what if you have something like this? Would that change your opinion? Does this explain the mystery that we saw earlier? You look at species, there isn't much mystery about them. You dig below Earth's surface, there's all sorts of stuff that once existed. Is the answer to that mystery that these ancient species were the ancestors to this one? That's what evolutionists would like us to believe. The bigger question, though, if I were to put the mystery in one sentence, is where does common ancestry end? You can make a geographical argument for common ancestry. You can use argument from the greater to the lesser. Look at all this variety in this group compared to this group. So if this group has a common ancestor, like horse breeds, why wouldn't this group, like species, have common ancestors? What if you throw in extinct creatures? What if you compare a whole spectrum like the bovid family and cervid family, the cattle, sheep, and goats, and the deer? Throw them all together in a sequence. Where do you draw the line? So the point tonight again is that answering this question is harder than it looks. There's more mystery than we commonly assume. So how do we move forward? How do you answer it? I'm gonna begin to tee up this question now and give you a longer case study tomorrow. And I want to draw on what the opponents of young Earth creation science, the anti-creationists, have said for decades. And one of the main arguments they've made against creation science also happens to come from basic philosophy of science. So let me give you three quotes here over several slides, just to show you that this is a common theme over my lifetime, basically, born 1980. And then turn around and see if this is a tool to answer the mystery of species. This guy is Niles Eldredge, colleague of Stephen Jay Gould, wrote a book called The Monkey Business. A scientist looks at creationism, obviously not in favor of creationism. And one of the reasons he gave for his opposition to it was this. He said, creation science isn't science at all. You've probably heard a version of this in interacting with family or friends and such over the years. Creation science isn't science at all, nor have creation scientists managed to come up with even a single intellectually compelling, scientifically testable statement about the natural world. Testability. I'll give you the quotes and then explain what they're talking about. 1982 was a court decision. On the docket was an Arkansas law that mandated the teaching of creation science alongside evolution. The judge said, no, can't do that. Not in the science classroom. Why not? Because he said that the essential characteristics of science are, and he listed 5 of them. And the 5th one, he said, is that science is falsifiable. And he says creation science fails to meet these essential characteristics. And I think this sort of reasoning was also the basis for the 1987 Supreme Court decision dealing with creation science. So there's a long legal history for this too. The reason I started here in 1982 is because I discovered that an assumption I had about this was wrong. And the reason I'm telling you this is I'm going to give you a quote from a textbook here in a minute. I thought I could go back to the 50s, maybe even back to Darwin himself, and find evolutionists talking in these terms, and you can't. At Ancestry and Genesis, we've got some older textbooks from the 50s, and they don't talk about this. And I think the reason is because up until the Genesis flood in 1961, you did not have national opposition to this. Yes, you've got the Scopes trial in the 20s and such, but in terms of an organized creationist resistance that is making scientific arguments, you don't see that. And so the evolutionary community had no need to respond to it. Then they're caught off guard. So Whitcomb and Morris published the Genesis flood in 1961, panned by the mainstream community, excites the church community, so much so that Morris had to leave his position at Virginia Tech, founds Christian Heritage College and the Institute for Creation Research in California in 1970. Tim LaHaye, I think, was part of that. ICR eventually outgrows the budget of the school. And the 70s were a real wave of success for the Young Earth movement, doing campus debates, thousands of students in attendance. And the evolutionists will talk about that era, the 70s, and say, we were unprepared. We were caught off guard. We weren't expecting these PhDs to advance scientific arguments against evolution. We thought we were just going to dump the Bible. They regroup 1980s. So National Center for Science Education, Eugenie Scott, all that gets started early 80s as a response to the enthusiasm, the wave of enthusiasm that was generated in the 1970s that led to teaching creation science in public schools. So you don't have these sorts of quotes in the 1950s, I discovered, I think because you don't have this sort of organized opposition. It's the 70s where it really comes in strong. The evolutionists regroup, and this is one of their main arguments against it, has been now for several decades. I just gave you some early 80s quotes. Now, in evolutionary textbooks, there are whole chapters dedicated to dealing with creation science. So this is a 4th edition of Evolution textbook, typical textbook for a 3rd-year biology student at a university. And it's chapter 22, I have listed here, is dealing with creation science and intelligent design. This may be a strange way to measure success, but you don't see that sort of chapter in the 50s books. You do see it now. They're just as antagonistic, but they have to acknowledge it. They can't ignore it like they did in the 1950s. So one of the arguments that Doug Fatuma and his co-author Mark Kirkpatrick advance against both intelligent design and creation science, near-earth creation science. They say the most important feature of scientific hypotheses is that they are testable. And they go on to say that creation science, intelligent design are not testable. So what's the idea of testability? Gravity, they would say, is a scientific idea because it makes predictions. So I've got a water bottle, hold up here so people online can see it. I've got a water bottle in my hand, gravity predicts that if I release this, so if you're watching this on tape, sorry, it's not real time, you'll just have to imagine it, but right now it's real time. Right now, me releasing it is future. Gravity predicts that if I release this, it'll fall to the ground. If I release this and it starts levitating, and all of you start levitating, we have reason to question the existence of gravity in this room, or the applicability of the laws of gravity. Of course, I release it, it falls, gravity works. In theory, though, I can test gravity. I can test it again, and I can test it again. I can try to disprove gravity by doing that experiment over and over again. The evolutionists have said now for 40 years, you can't do that with creation science. We say God creates kinds. They say, predict for us how many new species form this year. Something in the future. Some way by which we can know that this is true or false. The basic form of this then is sort of an if-then statement. If you fill in the blank, something is true, then you should observe X, Y, and Z. A way you should be able to test it. You should be able to do some sort of experiment. So if common ancestry is true, to use it, take a page from the evolutionists, they would say then you should observe a sequence of similar species. Or you should observe fish-like creatures and then half fish-like creatures. You know, this is the whole transitional form argument that Darwin recognizes as a prediction of his model. You should see a whole sequence of simple to complex, connecting ancient species to modern ones. That's a testable prediction. And of course, that's been the bane of the evolutionary model for 150 years. Where are the transitional forms? So hypothesis testing is what I'm going to argue is the way forward on trying to solve this mystery of species. I spent most of this hour simply raising the question, how do you know where common ancestry ends? It's harder to answer than it looks. Well, here's what I'm going to suggest is the way forward. Tomorrow, I'm going to give you an example, an extended example from just the question of the origin of humans as one species, trying to find common ancestry. To give you a few more illustrations of this evening, some of what I've just showed you is a form of this type of hypothesis testing. Evolution, of course, says everything has a common ancestor. All animal life, invertebrates, vertebrates, amphibians, mammals, primates, and such, all go back to a common ancestor over long periods of time. And if this is true, then we should be able to observe something like this. Descent with modification was Darwin's phrase. There's a similar pattern, one bone, one or two bones, wrist bones, digits. There's a similar pattern because they inherited that pattern from a common ancestor back here. There are differences in the expression of that pattern. Wing versus flipper versus leg versus arm. Because of modification, natural selection. Descent with modification. They'd say that's the expectation. This is the argument, if you've heard it put in technical terms, the argument from homology, homo, meaning the same, the argument from biological sameness or similarity. If evolution is true, you should be able to see that. If evolution is true, you should be able to find transitional forms. Those are two of the most often cited examples of evidence for evolution. The arguments from the evolutionary community for why there is no stoppage to common ancestry. Everything is connected. That's their point. So how do you respond to that? What might a creationist say? This is part of what I put, I think it's chapter 5 of Replacing Darwin. Yeah, 5. Let's do hypothesis testing with creation science. So in essence, what I'm about to tell you is that the 40-year-long argument against creation science is factually wrong. You can, in fact, make testable predictions from the scriptures that you can go out into the field and experimentally explore. Sometimes it takes a step or two of logic. So Here's the question, how do you fill in the blank? If separate ancestry, let's say we lump cattle, sheep, goats, and deer together, or not, how would you decide that? How would you separate that? If God created bovids separate from deer, how would you know this is true? So I haven't filled in the blank yet. What I'm going to derive for you very quickly is an argument from Genesis 1. Because again, we're dealing with textbook common evidences for evolution. These are what the leading evolutionists cite as arguments for their position. Genesis 1 says, God made man in his own image. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air. Of course, he commanded them to be fruitful and multiply. If you read Genesis 1, you see in the previous verses that God has dominion over everything, controls everything. And he delegates some of that dominion, and in a sense, creativity to mankind. God has created everything. He didn't reproduce it. He created it out of nothing. We don't create out of nothing. But there's an element about us that reflects something about God. It's still debated theologically, but there's something about us that reflects something about God. That's the point. So if we reflect God's image, could we not look to what humans have designed and the patterns in which humans have designed things for inspiration about how God designed things? Genesis 1 doesn't tell us the patterns in which God designed things. It tells us which days he created certain things, as Matthew referred to in the previous hour. Flying things, swimming things, day 5, land things, day 6. But it doesn't tell us the structure of the human forelimb in Genesis 1, or the structure of the equid forelimb. But we can look to what humans do and then get some inspiration. So that's my fill in the blank. Then the biological world should show parallels to the world of human design. You can make an argument for design by comparison. So here's an example of what humans have designed. Humans on 3 separate continents. This is a Toyota based in Asia ultimately, Ford based in North America, and then of course Volkswagen, German automaker based in Europe. Yet they've all produced, human engineers and designers have produced a model that has, so they all have 4 wheels, 4 doors, a sloping windshield in the front, headlights in the front, hatchback. Why? Is it because they all evolved from a common ancestor in the Arctic? No. It's because those designs fit the purpose and they reuse them. You don't reinvent the wheel. 4 wheels work better than 3 or 5 for these purposes. That explains homology. Why would God, or let me put this in terms that the theistic evolutionists might say. So Biologos has advanced this argument. It's a national pro-theistic evolution, God using evolution organization, founded by Francis Collins. They would say God could design these creatures in 1,000 different ways. Yet we see this pattern. You can make that sort of argument right here. There's 1,000 different ways to design these hatchbacks, but they've landed on the same pattern. Why? Not because they evolve, but because when certain things work, you reuse that design. This design works. Dave Menton was alive. He'd talk about, I think, the ball and socket joint. I mean, he taught anatomy and physiology for 33 years at Washington University School of Medicine. There's certain designs that work. I remember I was at a chiropractor and he was complaining, going on and on about the bad design of the human spine. I said, well, how do you improve it? It's usually a pretty good way to, I don't know, he started mumbling and fumbling about, would you make it stiff as a piece of iron? You can't bend it all. I mean, there's design constraints that affect all this, and we could spend a long time talking about that. The point is, this is as much evidence for design. You could argue that this represents design as strongly as you could argue this represents evolution. Both models predict the same thing. That's my point. Evolution and young earth creation predict the exact same thing. So if you're trying to decide which of these 2 does homology best support, you can't. It's in a sense a tie, which means when the evolutionary textbooks cite this as evidence for evolution, it's invalid. The only reason they get away with it is by saying from the outset, creation science isn't science. And when evolution is the only game in town, and there's no competition, then it's evidence for evolution. What about transitional forms? instead of arguing, so you can talk to my paleontology colleagues about whether or not these things exist. I want to do something fun just for sake of argument. Let's say transitional forms exist, just for fun. What would that do to the debate? Well, let me show you something, again, from the realm of human design. Again, the question is, the thinking is, we're made in God's image. We look to the things that humans have designed for inspiration on what God may have designed in Genesis chapter 1. So from the realm of human military engineering, human military, in the United States, military engineering. These guys have designed excellent means of delivering firepower through the world's oceans. So this has been done, of course. You send ships from California, from the East Coast to the Middle East. You've seen it in the Iraq War and such. It packs a lot of punch. Well designed for its purpose. This thing, if you plop it on land, is a sitting duck and will get blown to smithereens because it's not designed to move on land, but it's perfect for the ocean. If you want to fight a battle on land, you design a tank. This will sink like a rock in the ocean, will never take you from Carolina to Europe. But if you want to go in all sorts of terrain on the land and blow up your enemies, you take something like this. Now, what if you want to move between the ocean and the land? You design a transitional form that blends the features of ships and tanks. This guy can go on land, on the beaches, and can go in the water. Probably not something you want to take to go from California to the Persian Gulf. It's a long trip. If you're trying to get in that space between the two environments, perfect, perfect design. My point is, let's say this thing actually existed like that. Why wouldn't God design something for the transitional environment? Again, I'm not saying these things actually exist. I'm just saying, let's say we find some. Humans designed transitional forms that blend the features of aquatic vehicles and land vehicles. So let's say they found something like this. Evolution and creation predict the same thing. How can the evolutionary textbooks cite transitional forms as evidence for evolution? By first saying creation science isn't science, not part of the discussion. Evolution is the only game in town left, therefore evidence for evolution. In other words, I've just given you two examples here of this type of hypothesis testing. All the textbook examples of evidence for evolution fail because they do not distinguish between evolution and young earth creation. Now, the counter argument to what I've just said is the concept of so-called bad design. It's actually a very clever argument. Here's something that should be able to experimentally reject creation science and be evidence for evolution. They'd say evolution is a mindless, godless process that has no end goal in sight and just kind of tinkers and you get junk. That may work and survive, but it tends to be junk. If you have an omnipotent, all-knowing designer, he should make it right and good and well the first time. If it works poorly, how can you argue that it's design? So it's a clever form of hypothesis testing. This is why it shows up, I'd say, in textbooks. And I should make a side note here. I was at when I was at Parkside, University of Wisconsin, Parkside in Kenosha, they had a philosophy professor come in and give this is when I was an undergraduate, so somewhere in 99 to 2003, a Wisconsin-Madison professor come in, philosophy professor, to talk about creation science. And he chided his evolutionary colleagues saying, y'all can't make up your mind. Some of you will argue that creation science isn't science and therefore does not belong in the science classroom. And then some of you will say creation science makes these claims that we've tested and disproven. It's been scientifically falsified. You can't have it both ways. And you see that in Douglas Patuma's textbook. He'll say, well, there's actually some things about creation science we can test, and we know the earth is old, we know the universe is old, but also it's not testable. Kind of talking on both sides of their mouth. This in a sense is the same thing. Bad design is a way in theory to test creation science, which means all that talk about creation science not being testable is invalid. The professor, perhaps wisely, for the sake of his evolutionary beliefs, concluded that creation science was not testable, which is often how it's been adjudicated in the courtroom. We've just seen, of course, that's factually incorrect. This is a fun example to go through, though, and Jerry Coyne, in his book Why Evolution is True, will go through things like this. The so-called human tailbone, or the coccyx, is often cited. I'll just give you a few examples here of how this argument works and why it fails, and then we'll wrap up. The tailbone is cited as an example of bad design, or really there's two parts to this argument. They'll say, on one hand, there's a structure in the human body or in nature somewhere that doesn't seem to fulfill a purpose, or it seems to fulfill the purpose poorly. I can think of a better design. Think of my chiropractor. The human spine is poorly designed. Of course, you can't come up with a better design, but that's the idea. It's poorly designed. And then on the other hand, evolution provides a natural and superior explanation. Well, they'd say the reason humans have this nub on the end of their spine that seems to serve no purpose is because we all know we evolved from primates, from monkeys that had a prehensile tail. We had ancestors who lived and swung through the trees. And once we evolved out of the trees and walked upright, that prehensile tail was no longer needed. And so it degenerated into this little stump. All of these arguments are essentially arguments from silence, from the absence of evidence. And they all tend to fall apart as we do experiments. In this case, if you know someone who's lost their tailbone, and you know them well, you can ask them some personal questions, such as how their bowel movements are. And the reason I say that is the tailbone, so-called tailbone, or coccyx, is the site of attachment for several pelvic floor muscles. It's not functionless. It plays some very important functions, bowel movements, that we all appreciate and take for granted. You can thank the Lord for your coccyx tonight or tomorrow, whatever you need to take care of business. It's not functionless. That's the argument. What about the appendix? Another example often cited as does nothing. And on the other hand, evolution explains it because we had herbivorous ancestors who subsisted on plant material. And so we used to have this very big appendix that helps us digest all that plant material. Then we evolved out of the trees, became carnivores, omnivores, and it's shrunk to this little stump.
Horses still have that, the cecum.
Yeah, so they'll say, see, you look at herbivorous mammals, and the size of the appendix correlates with diet. And Jerry Coyne actually made this exact argument in his book. Then a paper came out looking at about 300 mammal species that did not find a correlation between the size of the appendix and diet, which made that part of the argument go away. The other part of the argument is, again, argument from ignorance. Its fatal weakness is additional experiments. We now know that the appendix is functional, plays a role in the immune system. And I should clarify here that there's a difference, a critical difference between something being functional and something being essential. Can you take out the appendix and live? Yes. It's not essential. But you can cut off my hand and I still live. It's not essential. It's functional. Pitchers can throw a fastball and then gently grab the hand with their tongue. It does a tremendous amount of functional things, not essential. Same thing with the appendix, functional, not essential. And of course, there's animal species where they try to advance similar things. They say that whales, this is a fun example for them, because they say whales have the stumps, the remnants of these hind limbs. So back to what we discussed earlier, or you mentioned with Tiktaalik. They say Tiktaalik fish evolved onto land, became reptiles, amphibians, mammals. Mammals evolved back into the ocean, became whales. That's why whales have this little leftover bone in the back here, because they came from four-legged creatures, but they don't need those hind limbs anymore. They've degenerated, and now we have the evolutionary echo of this. It turns out these play a role in reproduction. Without getting into the birds and the bees too much, copulation is trickier in a slippery water environment, and this helps it work. We'll move on. Okay, so all these arguments for bad design, these are just three of them. They are a great form of, if this is true, then this is what we should observe. If creation is true, we should find good design. Yes, absolutely. It was all very good over and over again. It was good, it was good, it was good. The evolutionists recognize that and say, if we find something very bad, all your Genesis 1 stuff goes away. It's a clever argument. The problem is it keeps getting overturned because we keep finding function after function after function. The same thing for DNA. Junk DNA, loudly proclaimed in 2001 when the human DNA was sequenced. And then about 10 years later, they did some biochemical experiments to try to figure out if there's evidence for function, and found evidence, at least preliminary evidence, that 80% of our DNA does something, and that number will likely go up. So hypothesis testing, I would argue, is the way forward to answer this question of the mystery of species. I'll give a very long, extended, practical example with the question of humans tomorrow. I want to give one more example, though, of a form of hypothesis testing that you're probably already familiar with. In a sense, evolution fits this. Darwin gave us an if-then statement in his book. If you've read Michael Behe's work, Darwin's Black Box, you're probably familiar with this. This is a long Victorian sentence, but worth memorizing because it plays such a critical role in evolution and disproving evolution. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. So Darwin's trying to explain all of life. So if you can find something, some creature, some organ, he didn't know about DNA, some section of DNA that you can't explain step by tiny step, that's the point. No big leaps, no miracles, then evolution absolutely breaks down. Now, evolutionists don't like creationists quoting this. They say you take it out of context. You need to read the next sentence. So we will. Darwin said he could find out no such case. So in theory, if we could find this, then evolution is falsified, disproven, the standard of science that evolutionists have demanded of creationists. I agree with evolutionists. We should give the full quote, and in fact, we should quote even more from On the Origin of Species. Darwin admitted in one of his chapters that our ignorance of the laws of variation is profound. He doesn't use the word genetics here, because genetics wasn't even the field of science at that time in history. So he didn't use that term. And this is not that Darwin was dumb. Everyone was ignorant of genetics at that point. So it's worth revisiting the question. Could there be genetic structures? He says organ, because again, they don't have the field of genetics to say DNA or molecular structures. Is there something that you cannot form step by tiny step? So again, it's a form of the statement. If common ancestry is true, then all aspects of life should be explicable step by tiny step, according to Darwin himself. Are there examples that you cannot explain by numerous successive slight modifications? Yes, sexual reproduction is the easiest example. You don't have to know any molecular biology, any genetics, male and female. How do you evolve the female if there's going to be millions of years separating the origin of the first female from the first male? Doesn't get going. You have to have both in place. What if the male evolves first? Can't pass on his maleness, but a female. Both must be in place. And of course, this argument explodes once you add in modern genetics and recognize there's very specific molecular decorations on sperm and on the egg that have to match up like lock and key. And if they don't work, reproduction stops, evolution stops. There's all sorts of examples of structures at the cellular genetic level that you can't explain by numerous successive slight modifications. Effectively, Darwin's idea has been disproven, falsified. Could genetics answer for us, though, the wider question of the origin of species, the mystery of species? Could it resolve for us the question of whether or not cattle and sheep, the white-tailed deer, and the moose have common ancestry? That's some of what I want to discuss tomorrow in the afternoon, right after lunch. Puzzle of common ancestry. I want to tell you basically a story of progress on human origins research as an example of how hypothesis testing, I think, is the key going forward to answer all these questions. 1:15 Central Time tomorrow. So, my main point of tonight was a lot more mystery around this question of species than we commonly recognize. Tomorrow, the main thing I want you to walk away with is that there are many more answers, perhaps some you haven't thought of, off the beaten path to this question that we appreciate as well. I've referenced this book, Replacing Darwin. I wrote this primarily for students, and in a sense for myself. The book I wish I had when I was a college student to hand to my biology classmates, to my unbelieving classmates, say, here, you believe in evolution, you need to read this book, 10 Chapters of Science, closes with the gospel, walks you through this. So chapter 4 talks about the argument, it's sort of rederiving some of Darwin's arguments from geography for common ancestry. Chapter 5 talks and shows how all the common evidences for evolution are effectively neutral. Creation and evolution predict the same thing, so you can't use this as evidence for evolution. And then, of course, I go into genetics, and without giving too much away, hypothesis testing. The simpler version of this is replacing Darwin made simple. I wrote this with a church audience in mind, though you can probably use it as a tract. It's basically a booklet, small, yay big.
Do you have it here for sale?
I do not have, I'm sorry, I don't have, didn't bring any with.
Oh, I'd have bought 30 of them. Bible class.
I say as a tract, so even though this is sort of the, what this book doesn't do, because I'm assuming sort of an unbelieving audience, is tell you how to use it. Because again, I'm thinking, as an evolutionist reading this book, they have their reasons why evolution is true, and I'm saying, nope, 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 nope. This book says, part one, here's how species originate, Cliff Notes version. And then part two is, here's what you're going to hear on the street. Here's what you're unbelieving, let's say you have a student going off to college. Here's what they're going to hear in the classroom. Here's the evidence for evolution, and here's how you use what you just learned to counteract that. Using, in a sense, of what you refer to, asking questions, planting seeds, and sort of a stone in the shoe. I remember talking to a colleague of mine, a former colleague at Ancestry and Genesis. He was talking about, I think, changing denominations, and I don't know from which one to which one, so you don't have to worry about me condemning denominations, one or the other. But he was saying he was at a church where a guest speaker came in and preached and contradicted what they believed. And he's like, hey, he went up to the speaker afterwards and said, hey, did you know what you just said? Contradicts what we have up here on the back wall. The guy said, yeah, that was it. But he couldn't shake the arguments the guy had raised. So he walked back home, laying in bed at night and thinking through. That's the type of scenario I imagine you'll run into. I mean, I remember being in Boston, we'd go street witnessing, and I'm too smart for God. Students come by, don't even want to talk. You can engage them and knock down every single one of their arguments. They don't care. If you can plant a seed, I mean, all of us are proud. There go we, except for the grace of God. If you can plant a seed, how do you explain the origin of male and female? Maybe they'll blow you off. But when they're going to bed at night, how do you explain the origin of male and female? Now you've got them thinking, and they eventually lead to their change in thought. Gave a 1-hour version of this. Here we go. You can find it. So you can find it in DVD form. We have a subscription service, Answers.tv, with hundreds, thousands, maybe of videos now, actively adding to it. You can basically get the whole DVD collection in this sort of a Netflix alternative, Disney Plus alternative, stuff for kids, adults here. And then I'll talk more about this book. What I talk about tomorrow will deal heavily with what has just come out in this book, traced. And in a sense, tomorrow will be the backstory to this book, showing its apologetic relevance. Now, I went really long, because I have a lot of time. Creation Museum, Ark Encounter. You can find me on social media. I'll leave this up as well. Q&A. Someone asked, what is the size of tailbone in human fossils compared to the tailbone of living humans? I think it's the same. There we go. But I'll leave that up here in a minute. If you don't get your question answered tonight or tomorrow, or again, if you're watching virtually, or if you watch the tape later, you can find me online. I'm on. I don't have listed here Truth Social. I will talk about tomorrow. I think I got a slide on it. Some of the research we're doing in the realm of human origins. We are continuing the research, and you can participate in future research if you submit your DNA. Or anyway, we'll get to that tomorrow. Even if you're online, I'll tell you about how you can contact me. We've got a little online portal that'll go directly to my email. Thank you for your patience and for the extra time to present, and I'll stop for a few questions.
Can I start off? There was one online from last time. I think you can answer, or maybe Matthew. The question is, why even bother talking about kinds of dinosaurs on the Ark? Is there a reason to believe they didn't just go extinct before the flood?
I'll start, and if you want to add something, actually maybe come down here. I can pass this to you.
Should I?
Yeah, come down here. Well, I talk about kinds of dinosaurs. I'd say my answer would be because the scripture says, I'll talk to the camera. Scripture says Noah took 2 of every kind of animal. So it implies that whatever was alive. So okay, so I guess it could be theoretically possible that there were things created that go extinct pre-flood, 5 centuries before the flood. And so Noah doesn't need to take them on board the ark. I have a harder time believing that, just theologically. I suppose you could have extinction. I'd like to think whatever was created is preserved until the time of the flood. And then he takes two of every kind aboard the ark. Perhaps the second more practical reason is, if you look at the fossil record, the dinosaur fossils are in flood layers, which implies they're alive at the time of the flood. If they're alive at the time of the flood, then almost by definition, they have to go on board the ark because of the explicit instructions given in Genesis chapters 6 and 7 for bringing two of every kind, land dependent, air breathing kind of creature on board the ark.
So I would just say that dinosaurs would have been on the ark because I think that it would have been God's plan for preservation of living organisms to save them through the flood. And so God would have made provisions for dinosaurs to be on board the ark. And if we look at the post-flood history, that's why we have dragon legends, that the dinosaurs slowly went extinct. And so over time, the way they portrayed dinosaurs sort of got twisted. And that's why we get these dragon legends from these disappearing dinosaurs.
And they're mentioned in the Bible too, Leviathan.
Yes. Job and Behemoth. Yeah. Yes.
I don't understand how homology is a prediction by the evolutionary community. It strikes me more as a retrospective judgment on similarities and an attempt to explain how they came to be similar rather than a prediction.
Yeah, okay, good point here. So, and I think Stephen Jay Gould talked about this concept of retrodictions versus predictions. Retrodictions being after the fact, hey, this makes sense in light of evolution. And I think that is correct in this case. That was Richard Owen. I think he's early 1800s, who establishes comparative anatomy. Darwin comes along 1859, and so this is evidence for evolution. So I think, yes, technically that would be a retrodiction, not something that they predicted, went out, gathered evidence, aha, it's true. And there are many aspects of evolution that I would say are technically retrodictions, not predictions. It's very hard to find a genuine prediction. Or sometimes when there are predictions, they are modified after the fact. And one of my favorite examples is from Ernst Mayr. This is actually in a book by Sean Carroll talking about evolutionary developmental biology. The field where, hey, we've got all these similar, homology, we've got all these similarities at the molecular level among fruit flies and mice and humans. We use similar developmental pathways and similar genes, all this stuff. Wow, isn't it evolution? And he tells the story about how Ernst Mayr in the 50s, I think, pre-DNA era, said, and he quotes him saying, it's basically, if I can paraphrase, it's basically hopeless to go looking for similar DNA sequences, pre-discovering all this. Hopeless to look for similar DNA sequences because evolution has been going on for so long. These DNA sequences would have mutated so much in these millions of years to be unrecognizable. Prediction in a sense, because we don't have the DNA sequence. Then we find the opposite. Fruit flies, mice, humans have similar developmental genes. Now this is evidence for evolution, even though it should be the falsification of it based on what Ernst Mayr said. Again, it's in a book celebrating evolutionary developmental biology, all these similarities that are consistent with evolution. So when a theory becomes so plastic, explains everything, it really explains nothing.
It really doesn't matter what the evidence is, they'll figure out a way to use it to explain evolution.
Yeah, one of my favorite examples of this, maybe in more real time, would be replacing Darwin. I put some predictions for mitochondrial mutation rates because it's something that hasn't been measured yet. It's fairly easy to go out and measure just the sequence of a species. All you need is one. Go find a tiger, go find a lion. Well, what's the lion mutation rate? Now you've got to find lion mother, daughter, and several pairs of these to make it statistically reliable. And it's just more expensive and time consuming. So those tend to be done last. So they're predictable. There's something that needs to be predicted. And there was an anonymous evolutionary graduate student reviewing the book, and his response to me making predictions about mitochondrial mutation rates, and then challenging evolutionists to make their own predictions. Well, his response was, he doesn't get to decide what we get to predict. Which is true, I don't. The data does. That's what's left. You can't just always be turning around and saying, well, this makes sense in light of evolution. It's a good question and a common pattern, I would say, in the evolutionary community. Lots of after the fact, hey, it seems to make sense, but little genuine, I'm going to make a prediction where the credibility is on the line. And if it's wrong, we're going to modify stuff. It all just gets incorporated over time.
So actually, I just add that, and actually, my very first creation science paper was all about, it's called evolutionary conservation. And this older Hungarian creationist notified me that when he read the scientific literature, very many times he comes across this term evolutionary conservation. Now, evolution simply means change. Conservation is its stasis. How do you move across the room if you're standing in one place? It's an oxymoron. So, you notice that there are genes or proteins which they're pretty ubiquitous in life. They're present in humans, in fish, in flies, and bacteria even. And, the sequence is like roughly the same, but as Nathaniel said that, it doesn't change into another protein. So I think that these genes, these proteins, they belong to so-called orthology groups. They're like functionally created units that God used to design organisms. And so in my talk tomorrow about molecular baraminology, we'll be talking about the gene content method, which measures the gene content similarity between two species. We can use it as a way to measure whether two species are in the same Brahmin or in different Brahmins. But I'm sort of alluding already ahead to my talk tomorrow. But more about this tomorrow. So yes.
In your presentation, you mentioned in Arkansas law and court, and as I remember it, there was a Louisiana law that wanted to teach creation, or that if they taught one, they had to teach the other, or something along that line. And it reminds me of, recently I went online to check on Wikipedia what they say about creation science, and it said it's a pseudoscience. And I thought, pseudoscience, that doesn't sound right to me. And then I looked to see what pseudoscience was. And one of the characteristics of pseudoscience is that it's based on your religious beliefs. So that I think, in fact, when that law passed, or the Supreme Court decided against that Louisiana law, as I remember it, that I was thinking they should have admitted that it was religious motivation that moves us to believe in creation rather than evolution. The argument that wasn't made, and I think needs to be made, is that this science, evolution, it's religious. They're religious belief. When Behe came up with this idea of irreducible complexity and the intelligent design movement and all of that, the way that they were arguing against that so vehemently, to me, it's like a religious fervor. And we need to start admitting that it's our religious beliefs that do not allow us to believe in evolution. There's really no, my experience when I went to college, I didn't go to a Christian college because they were teaching evolution. So I went to a secular college, and figured then I know where I'm standing. And the thing that impressed me was the evidence for evolution is missing. Unless you believe it already, there's no evidence, absolutely no evidence that I can see, no compelling evidence, other than the fact that so many people believe it. That's the only compelling evidence. And so then you get into this philosophical question of what is truth? Are we seeking the truth? And if you're thinking truth is truth relative or absolute, well, truth is genius.
Two more questions. I was going to summarize.
I just wanna make a comment. When I was in school and they taught evolution, they literally just barely touched on it. They just told us about it, and there was really no teaching. I don't remember looking at the book and studying it. It's just there.
As to what science is, science is knowledge. And so evolutionists, evolutionary theories, like theories in general in science, they come and they go. So one scientist, he put it this way, that science is the reduction of incertitude. And the very first day in college, our professor, Ersh Sotmari, he's Mr. Evolution in Hungary. He's like Richard Dawkins in Hungary. He said that we can never know anything for sure. We can only reduce our uncertainty. That's not science, because science is knowledge. That's what the Latin word means. It means knowledge. Where do we get knowledge? We get it from somebody who knows the truth, the objective truth. Who is such a being? It's God in his word. We can only know scientific truth from the Bible. The knowledge of God is the beginning of truth. And therefore, atheists, if they reject God, they are fools. I'm not ashamed to say that. Psalm 14 verse 1 is true. Atheists, if they reject God, they are fools. And you can explain this to them. And so evolution, not observable, not repeatable, not testable. So they charge that creationists that we're not scientific. As I showed that in baraminology, yes, it is scientific. We have a science. We study the handiwork of God, not the hand of God, not the supernatural process. We study the handiwork of God. We study nature. I mean, the science did not begin with Darwin. That's arrogance. Science began in Christian Europe in the Middle Ages. That is fact. That's historical fact. I mean, what else can I say? I sort of lost my thought. You want to add something?
Phrase of.
Yeah. Exactly.
I was just going to say apologies to those online. We had some long comments I couldn't quite repeat.
Right, go ahead, and then one more question, and then we'll.
No, I was just apologizing to the online folks. I couldn't repeat all the
Oh, no,
lengthy comments. So
Take advantage of you two being up on stage together, and I don't know if this is happening tomorrow. You know, Dr. Jeanson, I've heard you in interviews say, I've isolated DNA, held it under ideal conditions for a year, and I couldn't get good results with it anymore. And now we have Dr. Cherhati, however I say her name, and you say you have sequenced Neanderthal and
We assembled it. We didn't sequence it. We assembled it. It's
Okay.
two separate things.
That's what I wanted you to explain, because I thought that was an interesting contradiction.
but I think your question is the sequence reliable? Or you might say it is, and I might say no. That's, I think, what you're getting at. But
I think I must concede that there might be some problems with the sequence.
And this ties directly to your hypothesis, because in the secular world, the guy, at least that I'm aware of, who answers the thing you're trying to answer is David Wright. And he's written, Who Are We and How Did We Get Here? I think
Yeah.
the exact title of his book.
yeah,
Which I have because my secular scientific friend said I should read it, you know. And so I find that an interesting contrast, because he's basing his results on the ability to sequence DNA into what he would call deep time by assembling the stuff that you've assembled. So I'd be very interested in your critique, you know, today, tomorrow, whenever.
Okay, yeah, tomorrow.
Okay.
yes, it's not resolved. You'll have different answers from different creationists. Mine is essentially, I've had concerns for a while about its reliability, and I would say that I would argue we have independent evidence for its unreliability based on hypothesis testing, testable predictions, which I'll get to some tomorrow. But I think Rob Carter still would have a view that it's reliable. I don't know that he's worked out a model yet for, let's say, explaining human origins based on ancient DNA. But he's one who would say, I think we can use it. I think he's got a review come out or something, but so there's a difference of opinion, and it probably depends on who you ask.
Yeah. And so, for example, we can look at the chimpanzee genome and the human genome. You know, everybody's heard that we're 99% similar to chimpanzees. What's the fact? You see, first of all, they assembled the human genome, like I said, in the 1990s, and we have a whole genome sequence, 3 billion letters. Now, evolutionists simply assume that we are relatives of chimpanzees. So when we assemble the chimpanzee genome, they perform what is known as a guided genome assembly. That is, they take a purportedly relative genome sequence, that of human, and it's its underlying evolutionary assumption. And so, you know, they fragmented the chimpanzee genome, and they're mapping these read sequences to the human genome. And lo and behold, they have these whole regions of human chromosomes which are missing from chimpanzee and vice versa. There's simply no overlap. But the 99% similarity that they get comes from those regions which just so happen to overlap. But if you take into account these missing regions, the similarity goes down to like 90%. That's what Rob Carter says. Jeff Tompkins says it's 80%, so it's very low. I mean, I aligned the chimpanzee and the human mitochondrial genome because they're short sequences. You can do this, and I found that there's similar 90.7%. So this 99% is really a myth. They've just really selectively interpreted the data that's out there, and they're cherry picking the data. And this is what they're teaching your kids in school. Shouldn't be done.